In this lesson, we will learn how to create a new user account and how to programmatically authenticate a user using Spring's Authentication Object and the Security Context Holder. So if we look at our files within our project, you'll notice that we have added a register.jsp file underneath the webinf views directory. This JSP will act as a registration form, which will allow users to create a new account within the system. You'll notice that within the form, we are posting to the /register URL using a post method. This will allow us to submit that post, and that's going to contain all of the information we need to create that user account. We're going to process that request within the home controller. Now, we have a link established to the register page within the header file. So we will be able to navigate to this form in order to create a new account. Then we will post to the home controller, where we're going to set up some controller handler methods that will then save the user account and authenticate the user. So the first thing we're going to do is within our home controller, we're going to set up a request mapping, and we're going to map to the value of /register. And we're going to use the get method for this request. Now we need to set up our method. So it's going to be a public method that returns a string, and we'll call it goRegister. Within the body of that method, we're just going to simply return a string named register. That is enough to display our registration page. Now we're going to duplicate our goRegister method, and we will change the name of the method to simply register. We're going to change the request method to a post. So this will handle when the registration form posts to the controller and posts to the /register URL. When we do this, we want to capture the information posted by the form. So we're going to add the model attribute annotation, and we're going to add a parameter of type AutoUser, and we'll name it user. With those in place, we now have the information submitted by the form. Next, we're going to hard code the role for the user to a simple user role. We're not going to give them administrative privileges. And now we need to save that new user within our database. To do that, we're going to declare a new field of type AutoUserRepository, and I'm just going to name that field repo. And then we need to auto-wire that field. We'll import our annotations by hitting Control-Shift and pressing O. Now we're going to use that repo to save our user, and they will now be saved in our database. We need to authenticate this new user. Remember, they're not going through Spring's authentication process, so we're going to programmatically authenticate them. And there is an interface that really helps us perform this, and it's the authentication interface. So we're going to create a new object with the name auth of type authentication. And then we need to provide an implementation of that interface. So we're going to use a new username and password authentication token. So we will import those types. And the first argument that we need to provide into that username password authentication token constructor is we need to provide our principal or our user details object. So we're going to pass in the auto user because it implements the user details interface. We can just pass it in as that first parameter. Next, we need to provide the credentials they logged in with. So we need to provide the password. And then we need to get their authorities. We have now built an authentication object using the username password authentication token constructor. So let's talk a little bit about the authentication object. It is first created when a user attempts to log in. It normally stores all of their credentials. And then once a user is authenticated, the authentication object is placed within the security context. And we've seen this before. It's that interface that contains the get authorities, get credentials, get details, get principal methods that we can implement if we were creating our own custom authentication object. For right now, we're just going to use one out of the box from Spring. Now, once we have the authentication object built, we can now rely upon our security context holder. We can get the security context, and now we can set the authentication. And we're simply going to pass in our authentication object. This is enough to programmatically register a user and authenticate them within the system. And then we also need to switch our destination. So instead of going back to the register page, let's actually head to the root of the application. Let's save our changes, and we're just going to restart our server. And once our server restarts, we can navigate over to the browser. And at this point, I'm going to click on the registration form. And now I'm going to create a new user. We'll use Kevin B as the username, Kevin Bowersox, kevin@gmail.com as the email, and password. Okay, so now you see it has logged in Kevin B. And if we were to log out, we can log back in because we have saved this user. And there we see our user, Kevin B, logs back in. So we were able to create a new user using the authentication object and using the security context holder.